Hello and welcome. Good evening, everyone. My name is Rowan Conway. I'm a Policy Fellow and Head of the Mission-Oriented Innovation Network at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, that's IIPP. And I'm also co-author of the IIPP report, Reimagining Public Value with the BBC, with some colleagues at the LSE and also Mariana Mazzucato of IIPP. I'm delighted to welcome you here for this special public event. We're delighted so many of you could join us as well. Before we begin, a quick reminder to join the conversation on Twitter. The hashtag is IIPP_BBC, and you can follow IIPP_UCL if you want to see what our team are saying. You can send in questions and comments on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we'll aim to be dedicating the final section of this conversation to answering some of your questions. Now, the nature of this evening's discussion is about public value at the BBC. As an innovative public institution, global public institution, the BBC creates huge public value. But in some debates, many debates about the institution, there's an implicit accusation that the broadcaster is crowding out the market through the scale and quality of its services. In tonight's webinar, Clare Sumner and Mariana Mazzucato will discuss the dynamic ways the BBC can look at its value as a market creator. Rather than beginning with a market failure framework, which Mariana will go through in much more detail, which sees public organisations like the BBC as only relevant in their capacity to fix market failures, we'll discuss how to look at the BBC through a market shaping framework and how to design and test new metrics that assess how the BBC might deliver against its missions and public purposes, creating public value and in the process co-creating and shaping wider markets. I'm personally very excited for this evening's lineup. It's a special event that brings together in a fireside chat, so we're going to try and cultivate the feeling of a fireside, Mariana and Director of Policy, Clare Sumner. So I'll just introduce you a little bit to their backgrounds. Clare Sumner is the BBC's Director of Policy, leading the development of UK and EU public policy in areas of strategic importance to the BBC, as well as leading the BBC's government relations at the UK and EU levels. She's responsible for the BBC's regulatory strategy and relationship with the BBC's regulator, Ofcom. Professor Mariana Mazzucato is founding director of the UCL Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose, that's here at IIPP, and professor in the economics of innovation and public value. She is the author of 3 highly acclaimed books, including The Entrepreneurial State, The Value of Everything, and the latest, which is Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. She advises policymakers around the world on innovation-led, inclusive and sustainable growth, and is co-author of this report that we will also be discussing this evening, and we'll share a link to it in the chat called Reimagining Public Value at the BBC. So before we get into the discussion, I'm briefly going to share my screen to take you through a little bit of the headlines from the IIPP report, which is actually called Creating and Measuring Dynamic Value at the BBC. It's the summary of a very short, rapid prototyping and experimentation program that we did with the BBC in the summer of 2020, all virtually, of course. And then we'll go to the panel for a much more broad-ranging discussion about what dynamic public value means in the context of the BBC. So as I handle the transfer to sharing my screen, apologies if there's any glitches as we go there. And, oops. So the key essay question, if you like, when we first started working with the BBC, really bringing together this thinking about broadening the concept of public value, really starts with this: what is it that you measure, and how do you understand what public value is beyond what you're measuring currently? So while we see that the key aspect of the BBC is its ability to provide this universal content and investments in genres like news, current affairs, education and cultural programming that otherwise cannot be provided by the public sector, it really only captures part of what the BBC does. So we wanted to look at how to build a bigger picture. So IIPP worked with the BBC across the whole organisation to explore ways to broaden this concept of public value beyond the kind of allocative efficiency or the cost benefits analysis. So we started this with an immersive programme of public value mapping. Public value mapping is a process of looking at more abstract concepts, expanding the concept of value beyond what traditional economics might allow for. So we wanted to look at it in this way. So this was a series of workshops that were informed by some work at other parts of UCL that developed a sort of transformative impact canvas, and we broadened that to thinking it through in the concept of public value. So we wanted to design a spectrum of value, as opposed to this sort of traditional focus that focuses very narrowly, usually on consumer value and investment and revenue returns. We wanted to widen that out to really be able to encompass everything that could include social value, diversity and representation, and some of the kind of policy agendas like the levelling up agenda, or how do we think about innovation and technology advances. So that then became, as part of a series of workshops, we started being able to look at that in a bit more detail, and saw emerging out of that framework that could actually say an expanded view of public value, specifically in the context of the BBC, expands beyond just this cost benefit analysis and consumer value into what is there as individual value, but then also what's there as wider societal value. And then importantly, and Mariana will speak to this in a lot more detail, industry value, so innovation value, the value of actually setting standards and involving the organization in some of the kind of leading edge technological advances that the UK is involved in. So we then went through a process of dividing up a series of sort of statements that might encapsulate what these different types of value might look like. So being able to, if you like, create domains in which these different value types could be housed. And then from there, we started looking at, it's important to recognize that cost benefit analysis is still very important. So we're not saying throw that particular measure away, but how do you need to augment the evaluation framework so that it can really account for the market shaping effects? So it's not just value for money that we're looking for from the BBC, but also this wider value creation. So by looking at that spectrum of value, we then said, how do you maybe look at that in the context of a dynamic public value evaluation system? We then prototyped something that looks like this, which is effectively a mission framework that really puts in the public purposes that build these conceits of individual value, industry value, and societal value, and then runs through these direct measures that are absolutely vitally important. You know, to be able to have such a large platform with such a number of people engaged in it means that you have the essential enabling conditions to broaden out the dynamic public value at that market shaping level down the line. And we also talked about how to expand the concept as the BBC as the innovator that it is. So it's not just the BBC as a platform, and the BBC has done extraordinary work in really converting its consumer channels so that it is rivalrous with very dynamic and changing marketplace, but also to recognise that the BBC plays a really important role at the upstream part of the innovation chain. So the BBC is an inventor, supporting the discovery and avenues of new content, new tech development, and thinking about how new storylines can actually start to influence societal, or it be influenced by societal trends. But then also as investor and the anchor as part of a creative industries ecosystem, the investment in talent, the investment in infrastructure, the investment in partnerships and quality benchmarks means that we're part of strengthening UK industry and creative sector. So I will leave it there and do my stop share. That was a taster really to look at the work that we'd done, working very closely with the policy team and the chief economist and others within the BBC. It's always good to see the bigger picture, and that's what we're here today to talk about. So I'm going to start with you, Claire. You know, I think that the debate, the culture wars and all of the very hyperbolic debate about value at the BBC tends to directly focus on the licence fee. But with this event, it's not to ignore conversations about the licence fee, but it's really, we want to broaden the discussion to really talk about value away from cost benefit and how the BBC is funded, and shift into the question of why. Could you outline for us a little bit about your account of public value at the BBC, what it is and how it delivers for UK audience and the UK as a whole?
Great to be here today, and thank you to the IIPP for hosting us, and hopefully to have a great conversation. I mean, I think, you know, the BBC plays a unique role in our lives, in our society, and also in our economy. And if you think about our core mission, which is to inform, educate and entertain, which has, you know, lasted us nearly for 100 years. It's our centenary next year. I think the success has been actually our universality and our ability to offer, if you like, something for everybody across what is 26 million households. And that's an extraordinary number of people that we reach every day. And to your point on the license fee, we can achieve that in part because we are funded by the license fee, because that makes us accountable to all of our audiences. We are the biggest media provider in the UK. We're highly trusted, which is very important to us. And we're consumed, as that film showed, by 90% of adults and 80% of young people every week. We are still incredibly relevant, despite what some of the critics might have you believe. And we're one of the top British brands across the world, reaching out to almost 500 million people with the incredible world service, which certainly has really been very well used during the pandemic crisis, providing people with trusted information at this critical moment. But I think when you look at the BBC, we've got to consider the universality, we've got to consider its economic impact. And we've published today, and I think it will be in the chat, a new KPMG report, which shows us as a really successful and critical intervention into the UK's creative economy, with an overall GVA of £2.63, which is far higher than the industry average. But also, and I think Mariana will talk more about this, and your report really highlights this, the role of the BBC as a market shaper, I think, is a fundamentally new concept to this debate. We've talked a lot about public value, but I think sometimes in quite a static way. And I think for me, that's one of the really exciting outputs of this piece of work. So if I start with universality, because that feels to me, you know, a critical place for us all to kind of just understand, you know, any debate about the BBC always quickly goes to the license fee, the mechanic, if you like, by which we're funded. And it too often gets caught up in the question of how, rather the question of why. In other words, what is it that our current funding model delivers for UK audiences and for the UK as a whole in terms of public and economic value? The license fee is not an end in itself, but it exists because it's a surefire way to guarantee universal access to the BBC's programmes and services, to make sure they're available to everyone. It makes us directly accountable to the whole country. Because all audiences pay for us, we have to work hard to make sure all audiences get something from us. And I think during the COVID pandemic, the importance of universal public service broadcasting could hardly have been clearer for individuals and society. Everyone has been able to come to us for trusted news and essential information. Everyone has been able to rely on our services for support and advice, for help with homeschooling for many of us who are parents, and also for much needed companionship and entertainment in some of those darker moments. And throughout this, which has always been a critical part of our role, we are here to counter disinformation and fake news. And that role as an impartial news provider, and I think, Rowan, it's on your wheel of things to consider, is absolutely critical for societal value and democracy. And for audiences, I think it's the economies of scale here that also make sense. We all contribute, so we all benefit from that huge breadth and range of BBC services, whether that's news, whether it's audio, whether it's TV, or whether it's iPlayer. And if you think about a bundle of subscriptions, in terms of to get the same value, that would cost over £400 compared to a license fee of £159. Now, if you think about that in terms of pence, it's about 43p a day. And there's not much actually that you can get of great value for 43p a day anymore. So, you know, I think it's really important to stress that great individual value that we play and the great societal value that we play. And we are the most used media brand in the UK. And we are the UK's most used public service, which is another interesting thing in this debate. The other thing I want to draw out is the value to the creative economy. I mean, this is a UK success story, right? The media ecology is thriving. It's a unique mix, and I think Mariana will talk more about this, of public and private intervention, of collaboration across the sectors. The creative industries are actually growing faster than the economy overall. 96% of BBC spend is in the audiovisual sector, meaning the BBC and the money it spends with suppliers represents 13% of the sector. That's worth in total around 20 billion to the UK economy each year. These are not small numbers. And the KPMG report shows in effect that we have, as I said earlier, an overall GVA impact of £2.63, but substantially actually, and this is really important at the moment for the UK, over 50% of that impact is generated across the UK compared to a sector average of 20%. So what we do across the whole of the UK as the BBC is critically important. We sustain hundreds of independent production companies, writers, talent, freelancers, as well as 14,000 suppliers, of which 8,400 are SMEs. You know, we are a creative industry of lots of individuals creating great content across the UK. And we support 53,000 jobs. We've made considerable investment in hubs like Cardiff, Bristol, Salford, which have really anchored the creative economy in those areas and shown great growth. And this is because the BBC's role must make the BBC licence fee count for individuals, for society, and for economic impact. I'm not going to say too much about the next section, and some of you may have heard me speak about this before, but I think that the role that the BBC plays in helping shape the market is a new idea. And I think it's a really interesting idea, both in terms of public policy and also in the way that the BBC is regulated. If you think about the BBC, we were one of the first organisations to try and measure public value, and written into our charter is the importance of balancing public value and market impact, showing in effect the justification for this type of intervention, which we are incredibly privileged and feel incredibly privileged to have, because it's actually an ecosystem that really, really works. And traditionally, the BBC has been described, if you like, as a market failure organisation and not as the innovator and risk taker that I believe we really are. And that's partly we can take those risks because of the way that we're funded, but we can also take those risks because we have great expertise and cutting edge technology. Many of you may not know, but actually it was the iPlayer in 2007 that has actually trailblazed for the whole of the streaming industry. And don't take my word for that. You know, Reed Hastings has been very generous in saying, actually, that's where this all started. It started with the BBC. If you think the journey we've been on from, you know, radio and it's all gathered around our sets in the Second World War, to television, from black and white to colour, and now to the iPlayer, it's an incredible story and history of innovation and actually shaping other interventions in a very creative way. I think the other thing I think is really important is that actually some of the things that you might say, well, actually everybody can do that, whether that's entertainment or drama or things like Strictly Come Dancing. We've taken those formats and ideas across the world in a way which has actually changed others' behaviour and actually has created markets for things that haven't existed before. We've been so successful in this, if you think about natural history, that we're now having to deal with superinflation in the market, which is a whole different ballgame, but shows that we're very effective at creating markets and audience demand for the things that we really lead on. So I think for me, if we're going to shift the debate around the BBC's funding model away from actually what it is towards what it does and the great value it provides to audiences in the whole of the UK, we have to think about it more in terms of actually what does it deliver for the UK? How does it shape and advance the market? And most importantly, when you look back at the last year that we've had, recognising that we've been an institution that has been resilient enough literally to turn around in a day in the third lockdown, yet more educational support for school children who suddenly found themselves at home again. We're incredibly proud of our resilience, and our ability to do that is partly because of the way that we're funded and the institution that we are. So unsurprisingly, I think the case for a universal BBC has never been stronger. From bringing the country together in divided times to making sure British audiences can enjoy homegrown British content, which they tell us, by the way, is what they really want to see, as well as some of the global hits, to fighting the growing threat of disinformation with impartial news. And it's the universality of the BBC that enables us to make those crucial public interventions. And it's something that we need to keep considering as we look to speed the pandemic recovery now, back our strongest sectors, and play to our greatest global economic strengths. So I would argue that the BBC has never been more relevant or more important. And I'm delighted we're going to talk about this today and think about the BBC in a dynamic, innovative frame, rather than perhaps as something that's flat-footed or its time is over. Thank you, Rowan. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Claire. So thinking about getting on that front foot, and certainly Mariana's work around the entrepreneurial state tried to do that in the first instance, but I'll pass over to Mariana really to really talk about, as an economist, and specifically an economist in the sphere of innovation and innovation-led growth, what prompts you to want to engage more deeply about what public value means for public institutions and specifically for the BBC?
Right. So first of all, it was really fantastic and challenging also to work with the BBC, because unlike Claire, who works in the BBC and needs to kind of put forth the BBC line in an ambitious way, which we all have really engaged with very intensely. For us, the point was not to, in quotes, defend the BBC or to say the BBC is great, watch it or look at all these wonderful things it does. It was precisely to argue, when you have organizations like the BBC that are as ambitious and also successful as Claire talks about, they got a problem because the way we actually understand their role in the economy is so limited. At best, it's about fixing market failures. And that's the good stuff. Even this notion of the public good for other types of organizations, when they frame it that way, is still a correction for something that the private sector is not doing. So we actually don't have the language to talk about market creation and market shaping. And this is something, I actually set up the whole Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which has its own curriculum. We're trying to change the curriculum, so the training that is offered to civil servants globally, in order actually to see themselves as individuals also as value co-creators, not just at best enablers, facilitators, de-riskers of the risk takers somewhere else, right? So the whole concept of value creation and wealth creation too often is seen as just what the private sector does. And the public sector is, again, at best there to fix problems along the way, to fill a gap when it's not served, or using the sexy language, again, de-risking, enabling, facilitating, and so on. And so what happens then when you do have an ambitious organization that does all the kinds of things that Claire talks about, we either just don't know really how to deal with it and can just tell stories about it, or at worst, we end up then evaluating them. And by we, I mean the economy and society, because the way that also public organizations then get their funding is not just through, say, television license fee, but also the treasuries or globally the ministries of finance decide how well did our public investments do. And so when they are actually doing something much more ambitious, and then we evaluate them through this very static framework of net present value, cost benefit analysis, or the question, which market failure was fixed? If we can't answer, that in this kind of like really siloed box, the danger is that those same organizations then don't get the next round of funding, or are also submitted to this kind of relentless attack, which can also be through storytelling. It's not just an attack in terms of you don't get the funds, it's kind of the narrative that, that surrounds them. And so I think what's really interesting for us with the BBC is it's been exposed to all of that. This notion that it's crowding out business. Why is it crowding out business? Because it's so successful, it's taking up too much space. So instead of actually looking at what is it doing, how is it actually pushing the frontiers of different areas, and then the benefits that can have for business, because a whole new area is created, which then they can enter and play in. If we don't have, again, both the story, but also the framings and the metrics, the quantitative metrics to capture that, we have a problem. And what's really interesting, if you compare the BBC, say, to public broadcasting service, PBS in the United States, which is also really good. I used to live in the US, I would watch the PBS news and programs, but it's very limited. And as good as it is, because it does create great programs, it really is in some ways a market fixing institution. It's doing the kinds of programs, high quality news, great documentaries, and other kind of cultural formats that you have less kind of commercial players in those areas. What the BBC has done is within any format, so independent of the format, soap operas, talk shows, documentaries, news, and so on, children's programs, sports, it has been a thought leader. It has been a path-breaking institution, which has literally created new spaces and hence also new opportunities for business. And that's the kind of crowding in. But what I argue in my work is that if we have to describe the good stuff as crowding in, that's supposed to be a good word. You're still crowding, it's just in instead of out. We again have a vocabulary, a narrative problem. And I think it's really interesting also to see this from like an industrial strategy lens, like if you think about what Claire was talking about, and instead of thinking of it in terms of GVA, think of it like a multiplier, right? For every kind of pound or euro or dollar of public spending, how much, GDP growth is there because of those catalytic effects. it's not only true that the BBC has a large one, and so does the whole creative industry, but again, that kind of crowding in effect of transforming a sector, that requires also a different type of analysis. And because it's been cutting edge, it's also really like an attractor of talent, right? If you are an institution that at best is fixing something or filling the gap of something the private sector doesn't do, or de-risking the risk takers, where are you going to want to work? With the risk-taking, cool, wealth-creating, creative area, or the market-fixing, enabler, filling the gap area, right? So one of the problems that we all know that sometimes public institutions are subjected to is the kind of failure of also attracting kind of the top people out there. They prefer to end up working for Google's, Goldman Sachs, the KPMGs, God forbid, often because the pay is much higher, but also because of that narrative of what those institutions are doing. What the BBC has done precisely by going against this narrative and actually being an innovator and a risk taker and a market creator and having really dynamic conversations about public value within, it's been able to attract top talent consistently in a continuous way, which, if you look globally, again, at other public broadcasters, I don't want to say that they don't have the talent, but it is more challenging. And so lastly, I just think that, from the industrial strategy lens that I was talking about, it's interesting to see that it's not only, good content in the way that we were talking about in terms of the individual value, do you like the program, the societal value, diversity on the screen, and combating fake news, industry value in terms of creating new spaces. But it's also, God, what was I going to say? I've completely lost my train of thought. Isn't that interesting to do that on Zoom? Oh yeah, sorry, from the industrial strategy. See, I got back. Good. It's interesting to see in specific examples, like you mentioned the iPlayer, but if you also look back at the BBC microcomputer, that actually occurred from a period where the BBC had what we in the Institute called a mission, right? The mission was to get every person to code and to kind of reduce what we call today the digital divide. To do that, they also had to procure in companies to create parts for what later became the BBC microcomputer, which found its way in every single classroom. It's not being sold today. It wasn't a commercial success, but it fulfilled that public mission of getting, students and like all over the UK with their hands on a computer at a time where coding, wasn't as sexy as it is today. To do that, they ended up actually helping to scale up companies like ARM and Acorn, which ended up being, two of the few kind of globally renowned tech companies in the world. So that idea that you actually are kind of purpose-oriented, mission-oriented, trying to kind of, push the frontier of your area, through that fulfill a public goal, and then crowd in business investment, but in this particular case, allow what would have been maybe some irrelevant tech companies to scale up and to be big global players, is itself part of the story that many people don't know. So I'll just pause there so I don't have another memory lapse. But I think all those different examples are just aren't out there in the public narrative. And it's not only good value for money, it's a great value for society and the economy, but in a much more complex way than when we're just thinking about, again, fixing markets, cost benefit, and net present value.
Excellent. And I think that there's a really interesting question about how you track the innovation, as an innovation catalyst, where does it go? Because you obviously, when you're catalyzing industry value, you're not ticking the box of, well, we own the fact that we created this digital skills landscape and built some talent, and then they've gone on to work in the private sector, and that's augmented private sector capability in the UK. So there's interesting questions of what can be claimed and what can't be claimed as kind of, what your value is in terms of the what you put into your impact metrics, but actually what you can look at is what you're aiming to create. So can
I just add one super quick thing, because I realized in the beginning when I said that, unlike Claire, we're not here to defend the BBC. What I meant by that also is that everything I just said and Claire said should be thrown back to the BBC to make sure it's actually doing that. As soon as you start getting lazy and buy into the fact, oh, we're crowding out, so let's be a bit more timid, or we're being accused of being too ambitious, oh, let's be less ambitious, or thinking just about, we have to show that we have a good GVA, we have a good multiplier, and forgetting about that wider picture of societal relevance. That maybe is happening in the BBC, big question mark. Maybe not, maybe it's happened in a particular moment in time. Without these ambitious metrics, we create lazy public institutions.
So I think that cues into thinking about the question of adoption, or how do you do this? We phrased it as dynamic public value in the report, with the idea that effectively you want to be thinking about dynamic traction as, you know, you're starting to catalyze value creation, but then over time it's also how the culture of the institution is adaptive and responsive to, and creative, importantly creative, you know, and part of that kind of creative R&D landscape. So a question that I have, which I'll blend actually with one of the first questions in the Q&A from the audience, is the question from the audience is, what are the strongest arguments against your proposition and how do you respond to them? But then I'd blend that with the question of, what are the challenges in adopting this dynamic account of public value in an institution like the BBC, which has this dual challenge of being, you know, a national treasure and being quite static potentially in the minds and hearts of people, and then also needing to be extremely adaptive as you talk about the challenges of things like disinformation, and knowing where and when to act becomes very, very challenging.
I mean, I think, first of all, I mean, I absolutely take the challenge from Mariana that the worst thing that could happen to the BBC is that we become lazy or complacent. And I think actually one of the things that's very heartening about the BBC is how proud we all are to work there. But most importantly, the talent that we can attract, Mariana. I mean, in the end, a creative business is a people business, and you are as good as the people who come and work for you. People here want to just actually keep pushing the frontiers. And I think that one of the really interesting things is actually, how do we both do that and make sure that, if you like, and I think you saw this a little bit when you came to talk to all of us actually and interview us, that actually there's something in the blood of BBC people that is public value orientated. That's one of the reasons why we all go there, right? It's one of the reasons why I'm there. But interestingly, how do we really nail this in a way that is a combination of narrative? Because I think, Mariana, a lot of your work has stressed the importance actually of making sure that actually organisations don't get trapped within a narrative. And I sometimes worry that the BBC gets trapped in quite a negative narrative, which actually then ends up with, is the BBC being too defensive? And actually, we're really open to this debate. We are really open to being challenged. But most importantly for me is, when you start to look at big, you know, political issues like impartiality, where you can imagine everybody has a view, how do we create a framework that begins to help us evidence that we are impartial? And at the moment, we do a lot of that through audience research, and quite dynamic audience research, and a huge mixture of audience research. So one of, I think, the opportunities from this piece of work, which I hope that we pursue together, is really thinking about, actually, in that huge breadth we have, where are some areas that we could really double down on and test out some of the things we're trying to do. And the other thing I think is really interesting, Mariana, and I agree with you, is that you don't want to end up with lots of static analysis. You know, obviously in the narrative of any organisation, you have some key stats and figures, but actually I think if the BBC is to remain as relevant as we are today, if we don't keep pushing out the frontiers, actually there's so much choice in the market now, and that's a good thing. The market is moving at the most incredible pace. If you think about the take up I said earlier, from radio to telly to online, I mean, actually the dynamics which have been accelerated by the pandemic now is just going through the roof. So, you know, we can only have a role as both a market shaper and a real creative force for Britain if we stay on it. And then in terms of what I'm really keen to do, which is then actually, how do we support that, as well as with sort of narrative, with actually hard evidence that we're achieving those high ambitions and standards that we have. And that's really, Mariana, isn't it, an area of your expertise? And we had lots of conversations about this, about how can we then get to the next step, because I think it's really important.
I mean, one of the things we try to do in the Institute is actually to bring different types of public organizations together in different types of sectors. And in one particular place where we do this is through the Mission-Oriented Innovation Network. So we have organizations like DARPA, which is a innovation agency in the US Department of Defense. We have public banks like the KfW in Germany, the BBC, and so on. And one of the challenges, well, the point is then for them to share their experiences, the challenges and the opportunities of actually stepping outside of this pure market fixing box. But also, what are the tools to do that? What do you actually do when you're, a co-creator and a co-shaper? And one of those is you actually, from your remit, from the start, don't talk about which market failure should be fixed, but what are we actually trying to achieve? What is that kind of bold, inspirational target? And so what's interesting is that requires, again, a different language. You're not there to level the playing field. You're there to tilt it, move somewhere. But then how do you do that? You need a portfolio. So a portfolio of different things that you'll be investing in. But if I just compare the BBC for a minute to a completely different type of institution in that MOIN, mission-oriented innovation network kind of philosophy, if you look at, say, a public bank, the Green Investment Bank in the UK or the European Investment Bank, if they have a portfolio of different types of investments as they're trying to tilt an economy in a green direction, at any given moment in time, you might actually have wind and solar being, the high risk area, right? And then other kind of, old energy sources, the low risk. But over time, wind and solar become low risk, and, hydro and marine today are much higher risk. So what does it mean? And this is kind of a question back to you. I mean, do you do a portfolio kind of mapping? And do you ask yourself, well, this thing that we used to do, which was really cutting edge at the time, when we pushed the frontier, EastEnders, bringing the working class into a soap opera instead of Dynasty in Dallas, the 1% in American soap operas. At what moment in time do you say, all right, we've done that. We can actually now move away from that. That is kind of now for business. And our next big kind of pushing the frontier moment is in this other space, just to make sure your portfolio really is kind of distributed and you're not getting, in quotes, lazy, just kind of sticking with the easy stuff when actually someone else can do it instead of you. Like, do you have those conversations? Because that's a bit more concrete than just talking about public value. It is kind of like the risk reward distribution within a portfolio of investments. At any moment in time, you need to be looking at, is it still actually high risk? And if not, is that really an area for us?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good question, because what we've tried to do recently, in particular, with actually some structural changes within the BBC, actually bringing together everything, if you like, content related under Charlotte Moore as our Chief Content Officer. And one of the reasons we did that is to really look radically at our portfolio, both in terms of linear and online. So you can imagine people here would say, blimey O'Reilly BBC, why do you still need linear channels, or why don't you do more digitally here in terms of innovation? And when we look at those quite difficult decisions, what you begin to really frame, and the market is changing in this way too, we're a huge investor in content first and foremost, actually. Those ideas, those stories, that entertainment, factual, that's really what we do. How we distribute that now is much more complicated because of the nature of doing, if you like, linear and digital. And we know in this country, we still have a significant digital divide, right? So we cannot walk away from that at the moment, but we can all see there is a direction of travel. But then in terms of actually, where is our risk appetite? We really want to think about how you do, if you like, public value experience in this online space, which I think is something that the BBC could uniquely do, and also create those values. So yes, there have been criticism of others, if you like, recently, because actually we set the gold standard for editorial standards, online harms, which is really, really important. We can't rest on our laurels there. What we then need to think about is the next step on that journey, about how do we engage with people digitally? How can they trust us? And also, if you like, in linear world, the schedule was the way that we actually, the Reithian idea of serendipity, which I just love, which is, we're here on YouTube, people may go and see something else because it's adjacent to us. That sense of you can go from the news to a soap, to a quiz, to a great drama. We're also thinking about how do you do that on the iPlayer? So what you don't serve up is, in effect, the recommendations that just say, Mariana, you and I enjoyed Line of Duty, brackets, it is fantastic, but actually here's just more crime dramas. Why don't you take that into a bigger space? So this is a kind of, important content example for us, because obviously that's partly what's driving our industry. But those conversations are also going on in R&D and accessibility and how we do that. They're also going on in other parts of our business, like audio, and how do we change, if you like, the audio experience of people, which, with Spotify and others in the market is changing fast too. But how do you give that a BBC quality, a public value quality, and also a dynamic one? You know, sorry, it's
Can
a
I ask
long
you a
answer to the
about
question, but it sort
Yeah.
of, you know, shows the range that we're thinking about.
Just on the R&D point, in my new book, Mission Economy, I cite the head of procurement in NASA at the time of the Apollo program. And he was very clear that when NASA, or if NASA stopped investing within its own brain, in its own research and development, because it was obviously working with lots of different companies, Honeywell, Motorola, General Electric. He thought, if we stop investing in our own R&D process, we won't even know how to write the terms of reference when we partner with business, which of course I had to do. And he talked about it as the danger of being captured by, at the time, brochuremanship. Today would be the PowerPoints of the KPMGs and Deloittes and PwCs. And so, you know, the BBC uniquely has an R&D department. I don't think most people know that. You know, a research and development department within a public broadcaster, that's fantastic. That's, you know, at admission that you need to be learning yourselves. You need to be creating knowledge, not just kind of feeding stuff out to the public, but yourselves undergoing a transformation. I think that's, again, part of the excitement of why people come and work in the BBC. But can you say a bit about what's happened to those investments? Is that one of the things that maybe over time has been challenged because of the kind of, I'll just say it explicitly, relentless attacks? Has that been cut, or is that still seen within as an important part of what you do and what your remit is in terms of being transformational? You have to transform from within.
Yeah, so first of all, I absolutely agree with that. You do have to keep transforming from within. We've had a really difficult period in terms of financially. We've been cut over the last decade by 31% in real terms, right? So that is a lot. And that has reduced our budgets, if you like, across the board. We have managed to keep the R&D function. We have managed to keep looking at, in effect, what are the some of the innovations that perhaps others wouldn't do. So we do lead the way in terms of accessibility, some of the kind of standards that we share. We obviously have now a kind of great iPlayer model that others can take from in terms of different public service broadcasters across Europe and various other places. So my short answer is probably as ever, we don't invest as much as we want to, but we don't invest as much as we want to in lots of areas, but R&D too has been impacted by that. It's actually a requirement under the Charter, which is really interesting and actually really important that this is recognised between the BBC and government as being something that is critically important to our development, but also critically important to the kind of UK ecology, as I was talking about earlier, because sometimes both through partnership or things that we can do, we can innovate and risk take, and then others can benefit from that, whether that's in effect more accessibility just through IT and through what we're doing. So it's sometimes, for me, I think you have those big moments, and you can see the same in medicine sometimes too. You know, you create antibiotics and you create these various interventions. I think we're very proud of the interventions that we have done so far. Do I want us to do more? And do I want us to keep thinking about that? Absolutely. And we have to keep reviewing our investment, particularly around now. There's a lot more superinflation in our market, including in tech, than we've had to face before. But I think those are challenges that we have to take on, if you see what I mean, and make sure that we don't lose actually that value from the BBC that we have been so good at, but we just don't want to rest on, you know, past successes, and we have to be very careful not to do that.
I want to try and bring in some of the audience questions, because we've got a nice, a growing portfolio of questions coming from the audience, but actually they nicely dovetail on the question of managing a dynamic innovation portfolio. And I thought it might be useful to just, because one of the questions is, did your research cover this? Did your research cover that? Is to say that we looked at 6 content or innovation areas or domains, one of which was content, and you've really spoken to that very deeply, Claire, but we also looked at standard settings and the important role that the BBC had played in setting things like DAB standards and digital audio and video. Looking at actually public debate and policy, we looked at talent and actually what the talent ecosystem has looked like for new skills and new talents, particularly in creative R&D, technology and digital skills. We also looked at technology advances, and then we looked at partnerships, because actually if you look at some of the really interesting things that, for example, BBC Studios has done to fill that gap that you have illustrated, that kind of the cut in the public funding and the growth in the commercial funding has been very much through the partnership. So we did look at through a broad portfolio when we were working with you, but there are now there's 4 questions I'm going to try and blend together. Let's see if this works. It might might be a bit clunky, but the first question was actually specifically around, does the BBC cooperate and benefit from open data initiatives, especially thinking about creating public value of data. I'm going to blend that with the next two questions, which is, did we look specifically at the societal value of the World Service and contribution to trusted news worldwide? Because, with the critique being that this was a UK focused area. And I think it's important to say this is a dynamic process. We want to keep testing it. So we could put more things into the mix. And then also what areas, so if we're looking at this from a particular question of the portfolio, the question is, are you looking at innovation for open data? How could this be applied to global impact and the world services? Where does cultural value, as the third question, fit with the model? An area of public value that's been gradually eroded in favor of economic value, especially in policy discourse. And then the one I'm finally going to try and bring into this is, where does this work in terms of the changing technological landscape? And, where will you work with online services and digital public spaces? And is that within the scope? So I'm giving you those four areas: data and open data specifically, global impact specifically, possibly through the World Service, but other means, cultural value, and then digital and online. How might you look at those things as the kind of creation of dynamic public value? So beyond that content sphere and into these other spaces, which potentially is about enabling R&D in certain ways. But we'd love to hear a little bit about how we might look at that together, or how you are looking at that already.
Can I maybe say a quick thing, because I think this is more for Clare, because I think we want to hear her kind of, inside the BBC, how these issues have been thought about. But just to kind of frame these questions also, I mean, the first thing is with, the global dimension, I think we did touch on that. I mean, the whole soft power of the BBC, it's kind of mad that the UK would think about, underfunding it or getting rid of it. Organizations take half a century to come back, budgets come and go. But a dynamic, mission-oriented, public value-oriented organization like the BBC, that will take a long time to come back. And it has huge, admiration globally. Everyone in their hotel rooms watches BBC World News. But that kind of soft power, I think that is actually something that people recognize. And I felt like we didn't have to, maybe we should have included in the report. It felt kind of like an obvious point that we touched on. I think the point about open data, and this is just me kind of coming in because I want to ask it back also to Clare, because you touched on at the end of what you were saying before about the kind of not just risk taking, but the rewards, right? How do we, as a public organization, or how does one look at the BBC as a public organization, make sure the rewards are in fact public rewards, right? So how do you govern data or govern, the landscape in such a way that the public benefit? In the same way you mentioned antibodies, think of the vaccine today, where the World Health Organization is saying it's not good enough to have a vaccine if people don't have access to it, if the patents, intellectual property rights are abused, right? So they call for a patent pool in order to foster collective intelligence. And that word collective intelligence, I think, is actually a word that we should introduce in maybe the next version of this report. And just kind of over to you, Clare, in terms of how you guys think about data in that way of really fostering that collective value creation and collective intelligence, which both the iPlayer example and the BBC microcomputer example, I think, actually help us think about.
Thank you. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think the first thing I should say is that actually there's something within the media sector now about individuals' data and how it's used that is quite difficult. So, for example, when the BBC puts its services or works with some of the big global players, we don't get that much data back. And one of the things that's really important to us is, in order to understand our audiences, we want a kind of open relationship and a trusted relationship around data. So it's one of the things that we think the government should be looking at really closely, and the regulator, which is about actually how is data collectively shared across, in effect, what is a private and public UK media ecology more effectively. And then in relation to what we try and do, which comes back to some of the R&D conversation around innovation, is be open and share some of the standards and things we're developing, and have that as an iterative conversation, by the way, not just like, hurrah, we've created this new shiny thing, because there's a lot of complexity in what we do. I mean, one of the things which is not so much a data example, but perhaps is an approach example, is when the sector had to consider how did we get productions restarted in a COVID environment, you know, we all come together and share our information and share data and share what we're doing so we can actually innovate and come together. So I think it's a really important thing. I mean, the other thing around the BBC, which is difficult, is you know, when I hear open data as well, I kind of think of transparency, and we are the most transparent media organisation in the UK. We publish huge amounts of data and audience research and everything else in a way that none of our competitors do. But I think that's a good thing in the end, because, for example, we've led the way on companies managing their socioeconomic diversity, for example. You know, we've led the way in the media sector of actually being very transparent around some of these things, some of which have been good for the BBC debate, let's be honest, and some of them have been more fraught. But I think it's important to be on the front foot in those areas where we can. I think the other question you asked me, and I'm really glad somebody's raised this, is cultural value. I think it is too easy, and I remember actually people from US studios being very open about this, that actually there was a danger, if you like, with what happened in the US around PBS and others, was that they lost really tangible American content. So what you get is kind of great global content, but you lose some connection back to your culture. And I think for the BBC, what we are really proud of is doing great British drama and storytelling. I mean, we are at our heart storytellers, and we want to do more of that, right? Which is why we're investing more outside London, actually, so that we can tell those stories better, that we can get the new talent from across the UK. And then I think you asked me about the changing tech landscape around actually online and public open spaces. We're trying to work out with the other PSBs, what is the next generation platform? If you like, what is the digital version of Freeview that is universally available to everybody in the digital space? And I think that's really exciting. And then thinking about the BBC in terms of doing more digital journalism, but in a way that's kind of joined up across the sector, I think is another area we're looking at. So I think we're constantly trying to ask these questions. You know, we've got to do things in a kind of phased and considered way, just partly because of the breadth of our organization, right? But also I think, you know, we're very open to partnering with people, and where we do, so for example, we did the microbit only a couple of years ago, which was again about coding, but we did that in a much bigger consortium of partners than, for example, we'd done with the BBC microcomputer sort of, you know, 20 years, 30 years before. So I think the other thing that's changing about the BBC, and I think about some UK partners in particular, but others too, is a kind of partnership mentality, because I think some of these challenges are huge, and not necessarily one intervention or one organisation are going to be able to solve them. I think, Mariana, is kind of where you get to. But the BBC does have a unique position in being able to convene organisations to get to those outcomes, because I agree with you. I think part of the trick here is to focus on outcomes, not inputs. And often the BBC conversations are very much about inputs and not necessarily about the real outcomes we want to achieve.
And the expenditure, I mean, just the words that are often used as expenditure instead of investment, right?
Exactly.
I mean, this has been an organization that has been an investor, a first resort, leading the way, as we've said, and then all the talk is how much are you spending? But I would argue that it has, I mean, the kind of UK specificness of the content, I can see your point, but, you know, given, you know, that the UK is an incredible global place, you know, the immigration, I think what's been really great, and we have a common friend, Tanya Moti, of course, who's also talked about, you know, the really important role within the BBC, but also provoking the BBC to get better at this in terms of representing the wider community with different types of abilities, but again, you know, ethnic, racial differences. I think that really has also been really cutting edge, and I don't know if it still is, but at least that there's that really dynamic debate within, and that public value is part of that, because public value, of course, has three dimensions. One is, what are you there for? What are you even trying to do? Two, how do you create collectively value, right? And how are you actually relating to the different parts of the landscape? And third, how do you then evaluate it? Right. And sometimes we focus too much on the last one, like what was done, was it good or was it bad? Should they get more money? But those three different dimensions, and, you know, creating value in a different way by being much more representative too of the different types of collective value creators is, I think, one of the most important points that often gets missed in these more static measures we've discussed.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Rowan, I don't know if that was a good attempt at answering your sort of 4 buckets of
Well,
questions.
I feel quite proud of myself that I was able to try and get 4 for the price of 1, because we have now run to time. And what I would like to do is firstly, thank you both for a fulsome conversation. I'd like to invite the audience, who's been a great global audience as well, and we have had questions from all over the world. And what I've done, because we've had about 18 questions, which of course we can't answer in this time frame, but I would like to commit to trying to have an online dialogue about this through a blog, working with Mariana and yourselves at the BBC to try and keep that conversation going. So there's a kind of promise and a signal that we'll keep the conversation alive, and that we really are keen to continue the conversation. One of the kind of final questions in the round was, you know, what are you able to publish these metrics? You know, how can we be part of that? And I think the interesting question is, this is a prototyping exercise. We're keen to keep testing and looking at these different domains of how can a portfolio work? How can we look at dynamic metrics? But it's very much in its developmental stage. So watch this space. There will be continued conversation in this area, and I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. We're now entirely at time, so I'd like to thank both speakers, Mariana and to Claire. So thank you very much to everyone for joining us. Thank you for all your questions, and we'll keep this debate going and live.
Thank you. Thanks, Claire, for being part of this.
Thank you very much.